For 12 years as a smoke jumper, I jumped out of airplanes into roaring forest fires, risking my life and wiring over $250,000 home to save my family. But when a terrible canopy collapse left me an amputated cripple, my own father looked at me across the Thanksgiving dinner table, laughed in my face, and told me I was nothing but a useless burden who needed to get off his property immediately. I thought I knew what heartbreak felt like, but nothing prepared me for the cold reality of being thrown out into the winter night by the people I bled for. I took a midnight bus to my grandfather's orchard with $45 left in my pocket, completely unaware that a sick family secret was waiting for me. My name is Sloan. In the smoke jumper cruise, nobody cared about your past as long as you could carry an 80-pound pack and face a wall of flame without blinking. I was 34 years old when my life fell apart, not in the middle of a burning wilderness, but inside the pristine, oil-polished dining room of my parents' house in the suburbs of Atlanta. The house smelled exactly like vanilla candles and roasted turkey, a smell that used to mean safety but now just made my stomach twist into knots. I sat at the long mahogany table, my metal and carbon fiber prosthetic leg hidden awkwardly under the white linen tablecloth. My heavy aluminum crutches were propped against the drywall behind me, leaving a faint scuff mark that my sister, Fallon, had already glared at 3 times before the gravy boat was even passed. My mother, Linnea, was busy fussing over the porcelain plates, the expensive ones with the intricate platinum rims that only came out for holidays. She wouldn't look me in the eye. Every time her gaze drifted toward my left side, where my denim pant leg was pinned up beneath the knee, she would suddenly find a speck of dust on a wine glass or remember that the rolls needed warming. I had spent my entire savings from my meager medical discharge check to buy gifts I couldn't afford. A cashmere shawl for my mother, a designer leather briefcase for my sister's fiancé, a bottle of aged bourbon for my father. It was an old, pathetic habit. When you grow up as the invisible child, the scapegoat who is only acknowledged when something needs fixing, you learn to never walk through a door empty-handed. You try to buy your way into their affection, hoping that this time, the price you paid will be enough. Fallon sat across from me, her diamond engagement ring catching the light from the chandelier. She was talking about her upcoming wedding. She wanted a 3-tiered fountain. She wanted a custom ice sculpture. She wanted a live jazz band flown in from New Orleans. Evander said we can easily afford the premium venue package, Fallon chimed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she looked at our father. Right, Dad? My father, Evander, sat at the head of the table like a king surveying his court. He was an imposing man, a wealthy real estate developer who wore gold watches and spent his weekends at an exclusive country club playing golf with city council members. He didn't answer her immediately. He just sliced his turkey with slow, deliberate movements. Of course, sweetheart, Evander said, his voice smooth and authoritative. Nothing but the best for my golden girl. I cleared my throat, trying to find a footing in a conversation that felt miles away from my reality. The venue sounds beautiful, Fallon. I'm just glad I could make it back in time to see it. Fallon's smile vanished, replaced by a thin, tight line. Well, Sloan, we're glad you're here too, but I hope you aren't planning to use those clunky metal crutches during the ceremony. They'll completely ruin the aesthetic of the bridal party photos. Maybe you can sit in the back row until the photography is done. The words hit like a physical slap, but what hurt more was the heavy silence that followed. My mother didn't object. My little brother, Declan, who was 26 and still worked a low-wage job at one of our father's rental storage facilities, stared miserably at his plate, his shoulders hunched in fear. How long do you plan on staying in the guest room, Sloan? My mother asked softly, still avoiding my eyes. The medical board finalized your retirement 3 weeks ago, right? Have you looked into getting an apartment? It wasn't a question of maternal concern. It was a countdown timer. I haven't figured it out yet, Mom, I said, my voice steady despite the tightness in my throat. The prosthetic is still new. I'm in physical therapy 3 days a week. I'm just trying to learn how to walk again. Evander laid his fork down. The clatter of metal against porcelain sounded like a gunshot in the sudden quiet of the room. When Evander went silent, it was always louder than shouting. 3 weeks out of the service, and already your hand is out, Evander said, his eyes cold and drilling into me. My hand isn't out, I replied, my voice dropping an octave, a defensive mechanism I learned in the trenches. I came home for Thanksgiving. I didn't ask you for a single dollar. But you expect to live under my roof, eating my food, acting like a charity case, Evander sneered. You come back broken, you come back broke, and you expect us to throw you a parade. I looked around the table. Fallon was casually sipping her Chardonnay. Linnea was meticulously folding her napkin into a smaller and smaller square. Declan looked like he wanted to dissolve into the floorboards. Nobody was going to stand up for the crippled soldier. I gave this family everything I earned for 12 years, I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. Every single paycheck from the forestry service went into the joint account. $250,000, Evander. You told me it was the only thing keeping Grandpa's orchard from being seized by the state. Evander laughed. It was a dry, ugly sound that rattled the crystal glasses. He leaned forward, his face twisting into an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. That money is gone, Sloane. Spent on things that actually matter to this family, not wasted on a senile old man's dead trees. Look at yourself. You're a useless cripple. You're a liability and a burden to my household. Get off my property. Get out of my house. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. The smoke jumper crews teach you how to maintain total panic control when the fire is roaring in your face. I reached behind me, grabbed my crutches, and stood up. It took me a long time, my new prosthetic slipping slightly on the polished hardwood, and I made sure every single one of them watched every second of my struggle. I picked up my duffel bag. I left the expensive gifts on the table. When I reached the front door, I turned around one last time. Not a single person at that table met my gaze. I stepped out into the freezing Georgia night, the heavy oak door slamming shut behind me, severing the last thread of blood relation I thought I had. The cold outside was sharp and clean, the kind of winter air that burns the back of your throat and forces your lungs to work. I stood on the concrete sidewalk, the glare of suburban street lamps reflecting off the manicured lawns of the neighborhood. I did what I always do when my world collapses into ash. I did the math. I opened my banking app. There was exactly $45.12 in my checking account. My retirement savings, my emergency cushion, the financial security that 12 long years of leaping into raging forest fires should have guaranteed simply did not exist. I had wired it away, $1,000 transfer by $1,000 transfer, believing every desperate email and frantic phone call my father had sent me while I was stationed in remote camps across the Pacific Northwest. I dragged my duffel bag down the street, the rubber tips of my crutches thudding rhythmically against the asphalt. I caught the 11:45 midnight bus from the downtown transit station, a grimy, diesel-smelling regional liner that crept south toward the rural counties where the highway lights faded into endless miles of dark pine trees and sleeping farmland. I pressed my forehead against the vibrating glass of the window, watching the distant Christmas displays strung up on old barns. The low rumble of the bus engine vibrated through my jawbone, sitting heavily on top of the other noise in my head, the mental ringing that hadn't stopped since the tree canopy crushed my leg in a canyon fire outside Boise. The doctors at the military hospital called it hypervigilance and post-traumatic stress. I just called it the reason I always chose a seat in the back row where I could keep my eyes on the exit door. As the bus rolled deeper into the Georgia countryside, my mind drifted through what I now call the Museum of Heartache. Memories of my childhood shifted into focus, each one an artifact of a long, calculated history of emotional neglect. I remembered when I was 16, standing in the high school gymnasium after winning the state cross-country championship. I stood on the podium, holding a gold medal, looking out into the crowd for my parents. They weren't there. They had skipped my race to attend Fallon's middle school cheerleading tryouts because Fallon had been nervous about her makeup. When I got home, my medal was tossed into a plastic bin in the laundry room, while Fallon's participation ribbon was framed and hung on the living room wall. I remembered the phone call from my mother 6 years ago when I was hospitalized with second-degree burns across my arms after a dangerous fire line deployment. She hadn't asked if I was in pain. She hadn't asked if I needed her to fly out. Her voice had been sharp and annoyed as she complained that my monthly wire transfer was 3 days late, causing Evander to miss a payment on the premium quartz countertops for their outdoor kitchen pavilion. For 12 years, my entire sense of self-worth had been anchored to a single load-bearing wall. I was the provider. I was the strong one. I was the daughter who endured the heat and the smoke so that her family could survive. I thought that being useful was the only way I could ever be loved by them. I had handed over my youth, my health, and my body to a group of people who viewed me as nothing more than an ATM with a military rank. The bus driver called out the name of a town nobody had ever heard of, a small intersection with a blinking yellow light and a closed gas station. I pulled myself out of the seat, swinging my bad leg forward with a dull ache that radiated up into my hip. I stepped off the bus into the gravel lot, the air smelling of damp earth and wood smoke. My grandfather's pecan orchard was another 2 miles down a dark county road with no sidewalk. I gripped my crutches, adjusted the strap of my heavy duffel bag, and began to walk through the dark, following the scent of the trees. The gravel driveway leading to the orchard was long and lined with ancient, towering pecan trees, their bare branches stretching up like skeletal fingers against the starlit sky. At the end of the lane sat a low, white farmhouse with a wraparound porch that was sagging on the left side. Behind it, stretching out for 40 beautiful acres, were the neat, geometric rows of trees that my grandfather had tended for 50 years. Even in the dead of winter, the property smelled magnificent. It was a rich mixture of decaying leaves, damp Georgia clay, and the faint, sweet scent of seasoned hickory smoke coming from the chimney. It was the only place on earth that had ever felt like solid ground beneath my feet. I walked onto the wooden porch, the boards creaking under the weight of my crutches. Before I could even knock, the deadbolt turned. The heavy wooden door swung open, and there stood Thaddeus. He was 78 years old, smaller than I remembered, his hair completely silver and his face lined with deep crevices from a lifetime of working under the southern sun. He was wearing an oversized flannel shirt, and his reading glasses were pushed up onto his forehead. He stared at me for a long, silent moment. He looked at my crutches, he looked at my pinned-up pant leg, and then he looked at the exhausted, dirt-streaked face of his granddaughter. I braced myself for the pity. I had received an avalanche of it from doctors, social workers, and strangers at the airport, and I was completely sick of it. But what I saw in my grandfather's eyes wasn't pity. It was total, paralyzing confusion. "Sloane," Thaddeus whispered, his voice cracking in the midnight air. "Girl, what in God's name are you doing out here? And what happened to your leg?" The world felt like it tilted slightly on its axis. I held onto the wooden porch railing to keep from falling. "Dad threw me out," I said, the truth coming out raw because I didn't have the strength to sugarcoat it. "I have nowhere else to go, Grandpa. I came home to help you save the orchard from the foreclosure. I brought what I could." Thaddeus stepped back, pulling me into the warm kitchen. He sat me down in an old oak chair and immediately put a hot mug of black coffee into my hands. He pulled up a stool across from me, his old hands trembling slightly as he rested them on the formica table. "Save the orchard?" Thaddeus repeated, his brow furrowing as if I were speaking a foreign language. "Sloane, what are you talking about? This orchard isn't in trouble. It hasn't been in debt for over 15 years. I own this land clear and free." I stared at him, my coffee cooling in my hands. "That can't be true, Grandpa. For 12 years, every time I got deployed to a fire line, Evander told me the orchard was on the brink of collapse. He said the equipment broke, that the crops failed, that the state was going to seize the land for unpaid back taxes. I sent home almost my entire salary every single month to pay off the emergency mortgages he said he was taking out to keep you afloat." The color drained from Thaddeus's face. His jaw went completely slack, and then a terrifying stillness settled over his features. "Sloane," he said, his voice dropping to a horrifying whisper. "I never received a single cent from your father. Not one dime. I haven't taken a dollar from Evander since he left for college 40 years ago. I live small, I sell my pecans to the regional co-op, and I have a comfortable savings account. The kitchen began to spin. The walls seemed to close in on me as the massive, towering structure of lies my father had constructed for 12 years came crashing down in a single second. But the letters, I stammered, my chest tightening. I wrote to you every month. I sent photographs of my crew. I sent birthday cards with money orders. Thaddeus rubbed his eyes, a deep, broken sigh escaping his chest. Your father told me you had gone completely no contact, Sloane. He told me the Forestry Service changed you, that you hated the family, and that you didn't want anything to do with an old farmer in Georgia. Every time I asked for your phone number, he told me you refused to give it to him. I sat in the quiet kitchen, the ticking of the wall clock sounding like a time bomb. Somewhere between the smoke-filled forests of the West Coast and this rural valley, 12 years of my life had been systematically intercepted, stolen, and laundered by my own father. The man I thought I was sacrificing my youth to rescue had spent those same 12 years believing I had abandoned him to grow old and die alone. In the morning, Thaddeus didn't ask me how I slept, an act of quiet mercy that I deeply appreciated. He simply set a plate of scrambled eggs and homemade biscuits in front of me and looked out the window at the long rows of pecan trees dusted with morning frost. You're staying here, Thaddeus said, his tone leaving no room for argument. And not as a charity case, Sloane. I'm 78, and my hips give out on me during the winter harvest. I could use a second set of brains and a strong set of hands to run the processing shed. I don't know the first thing about running a commercial nut orchard, Grandpa, I said, staring down at my prosthetic leg. Nobody does until they start doing it, he replied with a faint smile. People who have looked into the fire make the best farmers. You know how to watch the weather, and you don't panic when things get dry. You can't rush a tree, Sloane. It takes time to grow something that lasts. I asked him why he was willing to trust me so easily after 12 years of believing I had forgotten he existed. He turned his coffee mug in a slow circle on the table, an old man's habit. Because you got off a dark bus in the freezing cold and knocked on my door, he said softly. That is a hell of a lot more than your father has done in the last 6 years. Blood is just an accident of birth, Sloane. True family are the people who actually answer the phone when you call them from the dark. The winter months began to blur into a routine of hard, physical labor that saved my sanity. The smoke jumper service had trained me to use my body as a machine, but the orchard taught me how to use my hands with gentleness. Thaddeus taught me how to operate the heavy sorting machinery, how to check the moisture content of the nuts, and how to prune the low-hanging branches from my wheelchair, or while leaning securely on my crutches. The physical discipline was grueling, harder than my basic training, because there was no drill sergeant screaming at me through the mud. It was just me, the quiet hum of the sorting belts, and the endless rows of trees. But I noticed a strange transformation happening within myself. The frantic, screaming panic that used to seize my chest every time a car backfired on the county road began to dissipate. The deep, rhythmic peace of the orchard was working its way into my nervous system. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like my hands were doing something useful. On the second Saturday of February, a dusty pickup truck pulled into the driveway. I braced myself for trouble, but when the door opened, my little brother Declan stepped out. He stood at the edge of the processing shed, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, looking like a nervous child waiting for permission to enter a room. Hey, Sloane, Declan muttered, his voice trembling. I'm so sorry about what happened at Thanksgiving. I wanted to say something, but you know how Dad gets. He would have fired me from the storage facility on the spot. I grabbed an iron sorting tool and pointed to the conveyor belt filled with unsorted pecans. Drop the apology, Declan, and grab a pair of gloves. We have 3 tons of Stewart pecans that need grading before the co-op truck arrives on Monday. Declan blinked, a look of immense relief washing over his face. He pulled a pair of heavy canvas gloves from his back pocket and stepped up to the line beside me. We worked in total silence for 2 hours, the only sound being the click-clack of the nut holes dropping into the plastic bins. Declan possessed a gentle, quiet nature that had never survived well in our father's house, where gentleness was viewed as a genetic defect and an open invitation for bullying. He had spent his entire life keeping his head down and calling it survival. As the afternoon sun began to dip behind the tree line, the truth about our family started to pour out of him in broken, painful fragments. "Dad's lifestyle is completely falling apart, Sloane," Declan whispered, not looking at me as he tossed a cracked shell aside. "The country club membership, Fallon's custom designer wedding, the new high-end speedboats, it was all floating on your monthly checks. The moment you got injured and those wire transfers stopped, his accounts went completely into the red. He's underwater on 3 different luxury rental properties he bought on bad credit." I kept my eyes on the conveyor belt, but my mind was spinning the numbers. "Where did he tell everyone the money came from, Declan?" "He told the whole neighborhood that he was having record-breaking real estate years," Declan said, his voice bitter. "He paraded Fallon around like a princess while he treated me like an idiot servant. But that's not the worst part, Sloane. Dad is desperate. He's circling Grandpa's land." The phone in the kitchen started ringing constantly by the time the fields began to thaw in March. First, it was my mother, Linnea. Her voice had that bright, artificial, high-pitched tone she always used when she was pretending to be a perfect suburban housewife in front of her bridge club. "Sloane, darling," she chirped, as if she hadn't watched her husband throw me into a winter storm 4 months ago. "How are things out in the country? Is your grandfather being terribly difficult? You really shouldn't burden yourself with that dusty old farm. When are you coming back to civilization?" Not a single word about the Thanksgiving dinner. Not a single mention of my leg, my career, or the fact that they had stolen $250,000 from me. It was the classic family protocol: erase the crime, ignore the victim, and pretend everything was beautiful. Then came the voicemails from Evander. He didn't chirp. His voice was warm, a low, manipulative rumble that always signaled he wanted something. "Sloane, it's your father. We need to talk about Thaddeus's affairs. He's getting far too old to manage 40 acres on his own. Someone responsible needs to step in and handle the estate planning before he makes a mistake. Give me a call back." That single word, affairs, felt like a rusted nail scraping against my eardrum. I had learned from the trees that you don't have to react to every sudden gust of wind. I let the phone buzz itself to death on the wooden table. One evening, as we sat drinking sweet tea on the porch, Declan brought an iPad out and showed me a post on our hometown's community Facebook page. It was a lengthy, emotional paragraph written by Evander. The post detailed the heartbreak of an aging father whose eldest daughter had returned from military service, severely unstable and psychologically volatile. It claimed that I had isolated my elderly grandfather from his loved ones, moved onto his property without permission, and was currently exerting undue emotional influence over a vulnerable old man to hijack his life's work. The comments underneath were filled with sympathy from suburban neighbors. "Oh, Evander, you are such a good son to endure this. Praying for your family during this trial. Can't the state step in and protect the poor grandfather?" "He's setting the stage, Sloane," Declan said, his face pale in the light of the screen. "He's building a public narrative. He's telling everyone in Salem that you're a predator who took advantage of a senile man. He's planning to take this to a probate court to have Grandpa declared legally incompetent so he can take over the deed as his guardian." I sat in the darkness, the crickets chirping in the pecan groves. The younger version of me, the hot-headed smoke jumper who used to solve problems with a chainsaw and a loud scream, wanted to drive up to Atlanta and tear my father's house down brick by brick. But the orchard had changed me. It had taught me that the most destructive fires are fought with quiet, calculated backburns. You don't defeat a man who controls the narrative by screaming louder than him. You defeat him by becoming completely undeniable. "Why does he need this specific piece of land so badly, Declan?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. "Because a major commercial logistics developer is buying up every acre along the state highway corridor," Declan explained. "Grandpa's 40 acres sit right in the center of the project. It's the keystone parcel. The developer offered Evander a multi-million-dollar finder's fee if he can deliver the deed before the end of the year. If Evander gets this land, his debts disappear and he stays rich. If he doesn't, his entire financial empire goes bankrupt in front of the whole town. I turned to my grandfather, who was sitting quietly in his rocker, listening to the conversation. Grandpa, do you have the original deed to this property? We need to see exactly what we're standing on. Thaddeus stood up slowly, his joints popping in the quiet night air. Come into the back bedroom, Sloane. It's time I showed you the wall I built before you even left for your first training camp. The back bedroom smelled of cedar and old paper. Thaddeus reached into the bottom of a heavy oak wardrobe and pulled out a thick, legal-sized folder made of faded brown cardboard. He brought it to the kitchen table, turning on the overhead fluorescent light, and laid it between us. The first document he pulled out made the air leave my lungs in a sharp gasp. It was a collection of letters. Dozens of them. All written in my father's distinct, arrogant handwriting, spanning over a decade. Each letter was addressed to Thaddeus, filled with financial breakdowns and fabricated receipts. In the letters, Evander claimed that he was the one generously funding Thaddeus's property taxes, he was the one paying for the new roof on the equipment barn, and he was the one sacrificing his personal business capital to keep the orchard alive. Evander had credit laundered my entire 12-year career, building a fictional paper trail that painted himself as the saintly, self-sacrificing son, while never actually sending Thaddeus a single dollar. Beneath those letters was something even worse. A thick bundle of unopened envelopes. I recognized them immediately. They were the birthday cards, the Christmas packages, and the photographs I had mailed to my grandfather from remote forestry stations across the country for 12 years. Every single one of them had been intercepted by Evander from the rural route mailbox, marked refused by addressee, returned to sender in Evander's handwriting, and kept in his private safe so that Thaddeus would believe the lie that I had abandoned him. He collected them like evidence, I whispered, my fingers trembling as I touched the faded ink of my own handwriting on an envelope from 7 years ago. He made sure you thought I hated you, Grandpa. I know, girl, Thaddeus said, his eyes moist with old, unshed tears. But I knew what Evander was before he even realized it himself. He's a scorpion. It's his nature to sting. That's why I went to a lawyer in the next county 10 years ago. Thaddeus pulled out the final document from the folder. It was printed on heavy, cream-colored legal paper with a gold notary seal at the bottom. The title at the top read, The Thaddeus Avery Irrevocable Land and Agricultural Trust. The dense, legal language dictated that the 40 acres of the orchard and all its commercial assets were placed permanently inside an unalterable trust. Thaddeus was named the primary trustee for life, but the document listed me, Sloane Avery, as the sole co-trustee and immediate successor. A strict, ironclad clause at the bottom stated that the property could never be sold, leased, subdivided, or developed without the physical, notarized signatures of both serving trustees. I did it quietly, Thaddeus said, his hand dropping flat onto the paper. I saw how Evander looked at this land when the highway was expanded. I knew the only person on God's earth who would protect these trees was the granddaughter who was out there risking her life every day. You are the shield of this orchard, Sloane. Evander can't touch a single blade of grass without your hand on the pen. A cold, diamond-sharp focus settled over my mind, the exact same clarity I used to feel right before stepping out of a cargo plane into a sea of smoke. The situation was finally honest. The enemy had a face, a strategy, and a motive. Declan, I said, looking at my brother. On Monday, you're quitting your job at the storage facility. You're moving your things into the spare room here. We are going to hire a certified geriatric specialist from the University Medical Center to perform a full, recorded cognitive evaluation on Grandpa. We are going to build an airtight wall of medical and legal documentation around this farm. Evander wants a war of lies? We are going to give him a fortress of plain, boring, undeniable facts. Please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with the name of the city you are watching from. Every single interaction helps this video spread to more viewers who need to see that justice still exists. Thank you so much for your incredible support. By the time the humid Georgia summer bled into a golden, crisp October, the orchard looked more alive than it had in 20 years. With Declan working the packing lines full-time and my operational planning from my smoke jumper days, we transformed the old processing shed into a highly efficient wholesale facility. We had launched a premium brand called Thaddeus and Granddaughter Pecans. Our signature item was fire-roasted sea salt pecans, a nod to my past career. Declan, freed from the suffocating shadow of our father, blossomed into an extraordinary salesman. He took samples to every gourmet market, boutique grocery store, and restaurant group from Savannah to Atlanta. Our breakthrough came when Linda, the regional head buyer for a massive organic grocery co-op with 6 high-end locations across the state, tasted our product. She didn't just want a few boxes, she wanted a 1-year guaranteed exclusive contract for shelf space across all her stores. It was an order worth $75,000 in guaranteed revenue, enough to secure Declan's salary, upgrade our packaging machinery, and cement the orchard's financial independence for the next decade. Linda loved our story. She wanted to do a formal contract signing right at the farm, accompanied by a feature writer and a photographer from the regional agricultural newspaper. She thought her upscale customers would love reading about a veteran-run, multi-generational family orchard while they bought our nuts for their holiday pies. We scheduled the event for the final Saturday of the harvest season. The orchard looked like a calendar painting. The trees were heavy with the last of the crop, the sorting machines were humming a steady, industrial melody, and beautiful pyramids of gold-labeled pecan jars were stacked on every wooden surface around the courtyard. Neighbors from the surrounding farms had come out to drink apple cider from paper cups. Dale, a local Vietnam veteran who had mentored me through the complex process of commercial food licensing, stood by the sorting gate, smiling proudly. Thaddeus sat in his favorite green lawn chair right in the middle of the courtyard, wearing a clean-pressed shirt, looking like an old king surrounded by a community that respected him. I sat at a rustic wooden table near the processing shed, Linda sitting across from me with a sleek leather folder open between us. The feature photographer was drifting through the trees, his shutter clicking rhythmically in the warm autumn light. "This is a magnificent operation, Sloan," Linda said, handing me a heavy silver pen. "Your grandmother Ruth would be incredibly proud to see her fields thriving like this. Sign right at the bottom of page 4, and we'll get our first delivery scheduled for Tuesday." I took the pen, the metal cool against my fingers. I looked up at the golden canopy of the trees, feeling a profound sense of pride that didn't depend on anyone's permission. I lowered the nib to the paper. Then, the loud, violent screech of high-performance tires tore through the peaceful afternoon. A brand-new black Mercedes sedan came hurtling down the gravel driveway, kicking up a massive cloud of dust that coated the rows of pristine pecan jars. The engine roared as it swung into the courtyard, stopping inches away from the processing table. The driver's door flew open, slamming against the frame with a violent metallic bang. Evander stepped out. My father didn't close his car door. He marched across the gravel courtyard like a man stepping into a bar fight, his tailored Italian suit looking ridiculously out of place against the rustic wood of the processing shed. The smooth, country club smile he usually wore for the public was completely gone, replaced by a raw, desperate fury that turned his face crimson. He had heard about the wholesale contract and the newspaper feature. In a rural county, news travels fast, and Evander realized that his time had run out. The multi-million-dollar developer payout he needed to save himself from bankruptcy was slipping away, hardening into a legal reality controlled by the daughter he had thrown into the gutter. He didn't see a family celebration. He saw a multi-million-dollar asset being stolen from his pockets. He didn't lower his voice. Men like Evander never consider that an audience might see through their performance. They believe that if they speak loud enough, with enough unearned authority, the world will automatically bow to them. "Stop this nonsense immediately," Evander bellowed, his voice echoing off the corrugated tin roof of the shed. "I'm sorry, folks, but someone needs to put an end to this circus before a serious crime is committed here today." The chatter among the neighbors died instantly. The agricultural newspaper photographer slowly lowered his camera, his eyes wide. Linda froze, her hand hovering over her leather folder. Declan stepped forward, his fists clenching at his sides, but I reached out and caught his arm. I laid the silver pen down on the contract, calm as a Sunday morning. I turned my head and faced my father across the gravel, feeling the old, familiar steadiness of my smoke jumper days settle over my spine like a protective layer of armor. Slow hands. Low voice. Manage the fire. Evander turned to the crowd of neighbors and reporters, raising his hands in a theatrical gesture of paternal heartbreak. My daughter, Sloane, came home from the Forestry Service severely unwell, Evander announced, his voice filled with a practiced, dramatic tremor. He raised a finger and tapped his temple twice, looking at Linda with an expression of deep pity. She suffers from extreme psychological instability due to her tragic injuries. She has moved onto this property, completely isolated my elderly father from his medical care, and has been brainwashing a senile old man into turning against his own flesh and blood. He took a step closer to the table, pointing a manicured finger at the contract. This signing is an illegal exploitation of a vulnerable adult. My father does not have the legal capacity to authorize this business. I have my corporate attorneys filing the paperwork as we speak. This girl is an unstable manipulator, a common thief, and a financial burden that this family has carried for far too long. The courtyard went deathly quiet. I stood up, leaning casually on my crutches, letting the silence stretch out until the air felt heavy enough to shatter. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. 12 months ago, his words had sent me packing into a winter storm, but today, they were just empty pockets of hot air moving through the trees. He was the wildfire now, all noise and destructive venom, certain that being loud was the same thing as being right. I just stood in the smoke, breathing out long and slow, waiting for him to burn through his oxygen. When Evander finally stopped speaking, his chest heaving under his luxury suit jacket, his eyes darted toward me, waiting for the screaming match. He wanted me to yell. He wanted me to lose my temper and break a glass so he could turn to the newspaper reporter and say, "See? Look how dangerous she is." I gave him something infinitely worse than anger. I gave him the truth, delivered in the flat, monotone voice of a military accident report. You're entirely correct that there are legal documents involved in this farm, Evander, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet courtyard. Let's make sure everyone here gets a chance to read them. I reached under the processing table and pulled out the thick brown folder. I opened it and laid the documents out on top of the $75,000 commercial contract, sliding them one by one toward Linda and the newspaper reporter. This is the Thaddeus Avery Irrevocable Land Trust, executed 10 years ago, I stated, my finger tracing the gold seal. It was drafted by an independent firm when Grandpa was completely healthy. It places this entire 40-acre property into a protected legal entity. It names me as the sole co-trustee. No sale, transfer, or development of this land can ever occur without my notarized signature. It was never going to be sold to your logistics developers, Evander. Not 10 years ago, not today, not ever. Evander opened his mouth to shout, but I slammed the next packet of papers down with a sharp click. And before you claim anyone is senile, here are 2 independent cognitive evaluations completed over the last 3 months by the Chief of Geriatrics at the University Medical Center. They conclude that Thaddeus Avery possesses 0 cognitive impairment and has perfect legal capacity. The original attorney who drafted the trust has also attached a certified letter confirming that Grandpa came to his office entirely alone, clear-eyed, and specifically requested protection from your financial schemes. Linda picked up the medical evaluations, her eyes scanning the official hospital letterhead. She looked up at Evander, her expression hardening into pure ice. But let's talk about the real theft, I continued, lifting the largest bundle of papers from the folder. These are 12 years of wire transfer receipts from my credit union, totaling $291,412. Money I earned jumping into burning forests while you told me it was paying off Grandpa's fake mortgages. And these. I held up the plastic-wrapped bundle of unopened envelopes, are the 144 letters and photographs I mailed home to my grandfather, which you personally intercepted, marked as refused, and hid so that he would think I had abandoned him while you stole my life savings to fund your country club lifestyle. I turned my head and looked my father dead in the eye for the first time. You stood at your dinner table last Thanksgiving and called me a useless burden, Evander. But the paperwork proves that for 12 long years, a crippled smoke jumper was the one carrying your entire comfortable life on her back. The silence that followed my statement was absolute. The neighbors didn't look at Evander anymore. They looked at the ground, embarrassed to even be standing near a man who could commit such a monstrous, multi-year betrayal against his own child. The newspaper photographer didn't drop his camera this time. He raised it, the lens focusing directly on my father's pale, sweating face. Evander looked around the courtyard, searching frantically for a single face that would buy into his theatrical performance. He found nothing but cold, disgusted stares. Even the local farmers who had known him for 30 years turned their backs, disgusted by the revelation of his stolen letters. Before he could pull himself together to launch another desperate lie, the heavy leather folder on the table wasn't the only thing drawing attention. The expensive smartphone in Evander's jacket pocket began to ring violently. The ringtone was loud, a high-pitched techno beat that shattered what little dignity he had left. "Turn it off, Evander," I said, my voice cutting through the noise. "In fact, why don't you put it on speakerphone? Let's see if that's your real estate firm calling to check on the deed you promised to deliver today." Evander's hand shook as he pulled the phone out. In his panic and confusion, his thumb slipped on the glass screen, accidentally hitting the speaker button just as he lifted it. A frantic, screeching voice filled the entire open yard. It was my sister, Fallon. "Dad, where are you?" Fallon screamed through the phone, her voice cracking with a high-pitched, unhinged terror. "The catering coordinator just called from the venue. Our platinum wedding deposit check bounced. And there are 2 men in uniform standing in my driveway, with a flatbed truck towing away the Mercedes. They said the lease payments haven't been made in 5 months. What is happening, Dad? You said the pecan orchard deal was closing today. You said you had the cash." The phone call felt like a final, devastating blow delivered by the universe itself. The entire courtyard heard every single word of her panicked confession. The mask of the wealthy, self-made real estate developer didn't just slip, it shattered into a million ugly pieces right there on the Georgia dirt. Evander had built his entire family's social status on top of my stolen Fireline paychecks, and the very second those paychecks stopped, his house of cards collapsed. Evander's knees buckled slightly. He had to reach out and grip the polished black hood of his car to keep from falling onto the gravel. The arrogance was completely drained from his eyes, leaving behind the hollow, terrified look of a small, weak man who had finally run out of exits. "Sloan," he whispered, his voice cracking, completely stripped of its booming, country club authority. Lau reached out a hand toward me, his fingers trembling. "Sloan, please. You don't understand the pressure I was under. The market crashed. Fallon's wedding, it's her dream. If we don't get the developer cash by 5 o'clock today, the bank is filing for foreclosure on our house in Salem. We'll lose everything. Just sign the waiver for the trust. I'll pay you back every dollar of the $250,000, I swear to God. Just sign the paper, Sloan. We're your family." I leaned on my crutches and walked out from behind the wooden table. The rubber tips dug into the gravel with a steady, deliberate crunch. I stopped 2 feet away from my father, looking down at him as he leaned desperately against his luxury car. I felt absolutely no hatred toward him. I didn't even feel anger. The orchard, the trees, and the long, quiet hours of manual labor had cured me of the need for their validation. I reached onto the pyramid display beside me and picked up a massive, heavy glass jar of our premium fire-roasted pecans. The gold label gleamed brilliantly in the late afternoon sun, reflecting the beautiful canopy of the trees above us. I stepped forward and dropped the heavy jar directly into Evander's shaking hands. Lau caught it against his expensive wool coat, staring at it blankly. "Take it, Evander," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet whisper that was meant for his ears alone. Look at it carefully. That is the only thing from this orchard that you or Fallon are ever going to get for the rest of your lives. Evander gripped the jar, his lips trembling as he looked from the glass to the iron determination in my eyes. You stood at your dining table last November and told me that a crippled soldier was a liability and a burden, I whispered, my voice cutting like a scalpel. You threw me out because you thought an amputee couldn't fight back. But you forgot one thing about smoke jumpers, Dad. We don't run from the fire. We live in it. I took a step back, straightening my shoulders, allowing the entire crowd to hear my final words to him. The gate to this orchard will stay open if you ever want to drive down here as a real father who wants to apologize to his son and his daughter. But this land does not belong to you. Your daughter's life savings do not belong to you. And I am no longer your daughter. Declan, call the county sheriff's department. Tell them we have an unauthorized solicitor refusing to leave our private commercial property. For one beautiful, frozen second, a flicker of something real moved behind Evander's eyes. For the first time in his entire miserable, superficial life, he realized that his money, his status, and his loud voice meant absolutely nothing against a wall of airtight legal facts. A deep, heavy shadow of complete shame settled over his face. He didn't say another word. He climbed back into his Mercedes, his movements slow and defeated, and backed out of the courtyard. We watched from the porch as his luxury car kicked up a final trail of gray dust down the long gravel driveway, disappearing past the ancient pecan trees for the last time. I turned back to the wooden table. I looked at Linda, who was watching me with an expression of profound respect. I picked up the silver pen, lowered it to the white paper, and signed my name on the bottom of page 4. The $75,000 wholesale contract was officially active. The massive logistics highway project went through 2 months later, bypassing our valley entirely after our legal team proved the Keystone parcel was locked permanently inside an irrevocable agricultural trust. The developers pulled out, and without that multi-million-dollar payout, the financial ruin Evander had been running from finally caught up with him. The bank foreclosed on the suburban house in Salem. Fallon's Grand Country Club wedding was canceled, replaced by a quick, quiet ceremony at a City Hall package venue because nobody had the cash to pay for the ice sculptures or the live jazz band. Declan told me through the grapevine that Evander had to take a job as a mid-level manager at a commercial used car lot, living in a small 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city, his gold watches and country club memberships sold off to pay back taxes. The lawsuit he had threatened during his internet smear campaign never materialized. When your enemy has a paper wall built by corporate lawyers and medical chiefs, there is simply no case to be made in a court of law. In the deep gray of January, right after the new packaging machinery arrived at the orchard, I received a single letter in the mailbox. The envelope was made of expensive, heavy stationery, and the neat, elegant handwriting on the front belonged to my mother, Linnea. I brought it into the warm kitchen, sitting at the Formica table where Thaddeus had handed me my first cup of coffee on the night I was banished. I opened the envelope and read the 3 long pages. Her words circled and shifted, talking about how difficult the winter had been, how stressed Evander was at his new job, and how Fallon's life had been disrupted. She wrote that Evander isn't a bad man, Sloane. He just made some poor business investments, and then she landed on the phrase she had used my entire life. I always knew you were the strong one, Sloane. I knew you could handle being on your own without our help. She called me strong so she could justify why I received nothing while they stole everything. It was the same old trap, an invitation to step back into the role of the useful scapegoat who fixes their problems. I looked out the kitchen window. Out in the frost-dusted courtyard, Declan was helping Thaddeus grease the gears on the tractor. My little brother was laughing, his shoulders broad and his head held high, completely free from the terror that used to control him. My grandfather was smiling, his old hand resting affectionately on Declan's shoulder. They were working together, building something real with their hands on land that would never be paved over. I looked back down at my mother's letter. The old, trained reflex within my nervous system whispered that I should write back, that I should send a check from our new contract revenue, that I should be useful to them one more time just to hear them say they were proud of me. But I did the math instead. The price of their love was my entire life, and I was completely done paying for the privilege of being their sacrifice. I didn't grab a pen. I didn't type out an angry text message. I walked over to the old ironwood stove in the corner of the kitchen, opened the heavy black door, and dropped the 3 pages of expensive stationery directly into the red, roaring coals. I watched the white paper curl, blacken, and dissolve into gray ash in less than 5 seconds. The silence of the orchard was the only answer they would ever receive from me. 12 years of Fireline paychecks were gone, but a midnight bus ride had brought me to the end of a long gravel lane where my real family had been waiting for me the entire time. I chose to walk away from the money and let my toxic family drown in the financial narrows of their own greed, choosing instead to build a new life with an old farmer and a brave little brother on 40 acres of Georgia clay. Do you think my choice to completely cut off my mother and let my father go bankrupt without a single dollar of help was too nan? Or do you believe that a quiet, legally airtight success is the most devastating revenge a scapegoat can ever deliver? If this story reminded you that the stubborn people who actually answer the phone when you call from the dark matter infinitely more than the ones who simply share your last name, take this as your official sign to call them today and tell them you love them. If you know someone who is currently fighting their own silent family battles, please share this story with them so they know they aren't alone. Drop your thoughts in the comment section below, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and I will see you all in the next drama story.